Welcome to the Shadow Knows, where we journey into the depths of the psyche, mystery, and transformation. Hi, I'm Maureen.
Hi, and I'm Klara. Together, we explore the hidden forces shaping our lives, relationships, and our collective story.
We're honored again to sit with James Frazier, one of the country's most experienced breathwork facilitators. For nearly 4 decades, James has led experiential workshops using holotropic breathwork in non-ordinary states of consciousness.
And for today's episode, we pick the archetype of the magician.
This is really, in some sense, the most important archetype in terms of this kind of work for a variety of reasons, which I don't need to tell the two of you. So definitely coming back and spending future sessions on this would not be contraindicated.
James, in a general way, tell us a little bit about the magician's core function in the psyche.
Okay. Well, I don't think I mentioned this last time, but there is a way to talk about these four archetypes that we are discussing in this series as lines of development. You don't want to fall into the trap of just talking about the pure archetype. You also want to think about it, well, what is that mediated through me, a human, and specifically me and my inner work? So we talked about the warrior archetype. That would be considered to be the line of aggression. And everybody has to learn how to deal with aggression. In fact, many people never do, but it is one of our developmental tasks. If we applied that same thing to the magician, we would say the magician is the development of the line of cognition. Magician has to do with insight, the ability to see even beyond the obvious. It has to do with wisdom. It has to do with seeing hidden patterns. And thus it has to do with esoteric knowledge, esoteric vocations. It certainly has to do with ritual practice that connects us to the sacred symbols. The magician's really the mediator between the conscious and the unconscious mind. It's the psychopomp. It is the one who knows, the one who sees. And it is an incredibly important part of this fourfold quaternio that we're discussing. There are definitely very, very positive manifestations of this archetype, and then there are some very, very shadowy ones. The magician is the hardest to talk about, the hardest to teach. One, it's so big, but two, it's rather esoteric and rather hidden. It's technical, and sometimes it's discussing things that are, again, not exactly obvious.
Mm. So, James, you mentioned that the magician is the mediator between the conscious and the unconscious. And in the book, for those of you who aren't familiar with Robert Moore, he was an American Jungian analyst and the author of King, Warrior, Magician, and Lover, in which he describes the magician as the mediator of mystery. How does that role show up today, especially in how we relate to knowledge, technology, or spirituality?
Well, in variety of ways, but I think the simplest way to sort of introduce this idea is that uh, I would, perhaps tongue in cheek, but I would say that the magician is the second oldest vocation because it likely, and this is my speculation, I'll admit, but the earliest examples of magicians were probably the people in tribal hunter-gatherer societies who first began to develop memory. And memory is an incredibly important thing. If you go through a particular area and purple berries with white dots on them are blooming that year, and Uncle Fred eats a bunch of them and he dies, it's really important to remember that the next year when you come back through the same area. And so the person who developed that gift first, and memory is a developmental process, we believe, that became a very, very valuable member of the tribe. It would also be somebody who could intuit things like weather patterns, who could intuit where the game were. So the person who develops this inner sight and ability to see beyond, again, the obvious, becomes, in a sense, the first caretakers of the sensibility around spirituality, the sense that there are hidden forces in the world beyond what we can see. It's hard for us moderns to put ourselves into to this kind of position, but I think then you can follow that from that earliest expression. We probably would have pejoratively called the witch doctor or the shaman, maybe a little more charitably. But throughout history, this continues to develop and change forms. Eventually, it turns into things like the people who first learned how to work metals. These are really magicians. When you discovered that you could take a soft metal like copper and tin, which you can bend with your hand, and you could learn how to smelt them in a fire, and the end resulting product was hard bronze that was so hard you could make swords and wagon wheels out of them. That was a kind of magic, or pre-science. And then it turns into science, and then that turns into technology, and then now it's turned into whatever we're entering now, particularly in the realm of AI. It has to do with esoteric professions, everything from attorneys who, have their own language, to people like brain surgeons, to psychotherapists, to ministers, to people who work in the area of spirituality. But any esoteric profession falls under this particular line. So it's an incredibly important one. And I think it's one that our problem with it largely is we're not conscious of the fact that we're dealing with an archetype. So many people are possessed by this archetype and don't know it. Or they overinflate how much they're connected to this, which we would call inflation, also the Dunning-Kruger effect, of where people grossly overestimate their abilities because they don't actually have very good insight into where they are and who they are and what their limits are.
So can you talk about in more detail how does the magician archetype in its shadow form?
Sure. Well, it shows up at the first level of just detached manipulation. If I have esoteric knowledge, but I'm keeping it all to myself and it's only being used for me and I'm using it against you in a manipulative way, that's the detached manipulator. And we see this, of course, all over the place, of people using their esoteric knowledge to enrich themselves without any care for the culture. One example from the financial district would be the meltdown in 2008, which was caused by people who have very, very smart esoteric knowledge of the stock markets and mortgages. And they were bundling really bad mortgages together and selling those to investors. And then they created this almost imaginary thing called derivatives. It's a bet that those mortgages were going to go south or they were going to all collapse. So they made money both ways, and they knew what they were doing, but they didn't care because they were making millions of dollars in bonuses. That's the detached manipulator. Anytime anybody has esoteric knowledge, but they do not use it for the good of others or for the good of the culture, it tends to turn rather shadowy and pathological. We see a lot of that. In our folklore and our fairy tales, it's always the evil magician. In The Lord of the Rings, the great work of Tolkien, it's Sauron who's trying to gather all the power and he's using all of his magic. So in some ways, we're much more dominated by the archetype of the magician now in an unconscious way than we ever were in the Middle Ages. But now it's all in technology. So you can push this stuff all underground, which is what science thought it did when it separated from magicians and practices. For example, astronomy loves to claim that it never had anything to do with astrology, but that's absolutely not true. It was astrology up until really about the 1700s. And then the professional practice of astronomy began to separate itself out. And so now you have a kind of non-sacral practice called science, and they have done things that no astrologer would have ever dreamed of doing. I mean, we're looking at images from outer space that are billions of light years away. So again, it's sometimes it's a matter of just us pushing everything underground, but then it pops back up again. But I would say we're dominated by the magician in our culture and don't know it. So that's a kind of possession state. And manipulation is all part of that. I mean, think about our personal data. Every time I do something online virtually, it's recorded. Advertiser can plug into that and profile who I am and send me specifically personalized ads that have a much greater chance of me responding to them. Well, that's a kind of manipulation. It's just unconscious. Nobody knows about it. Or I could do a search for something really, really strange or not common, water main valves, for example. And within 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to be getting ads for water main valves. A lot of manipulation going on. It's just that we're not aware of it. So that would be a shadow side of it.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking we might be able to unpack just a little bit more of that shadow side. Another question that we had was, how do we tell when our magician is over dominant, overly analytical, controlling, or detached, which you gave an example of, and what helps to restore the balance?
Well, my experience with it is that usually main difficulty with a magician is we get too much of it. So we're flooding with magician, sort of start buying our own press in a way. Somebody outside of ourselves, like our partner or some other person or group of people, point out that we don't, that we're kind of possessed by this. Or our shadow comes up around it somehow. We get ourselves into trouble. Maybe somebody tells a lie and it's manipulation, but they only are half conscious of how big a manipulation it is, and then the thing blows up and suddenly they have to face their own shadow of, yeah, I was inflated in the magician. Or what I mentioned earlier, the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people overly estimate their abilities. For example, a young kid decides he's going to go bungee jumping, puts together a homemade bungee cord and goes to a local bridge and jumps off, only he's not as smart as he thought he was or as insightful as he thought he was, and rope is too long and he dashes his head on the rock. That's overestimation of one's abilities. Anytime we are intellectualizing our emotions, for example, or writing them off as, oh, it's just that, and not really processing them, that's another way that we can be detached. If we find ourselves falling into a kind of narcissism, that can also be too much detachment. So there are many different ways, but broadly speaking, it's usually when our shadow comes bubbling up and it becomes painful. That's usually when we become aware.
James, you just mentioned something important, and this is also coming from my personal experience. It was long after I started doing my own work that I started to notice that the magician was operating in me in a form of a defense, and it was defending against the feeling function. So, can you speak a little bit about that? How does it then manifest when the magician works against the feeling function?
Well, I guess I would also use my own personal story about that as well. I had a challenging childhood, emotionally anyway. I had a lot of woundedness from my childhood and some trauma that fed into all this as well. But quite frankly, it was just painful. So one of the things that I learned to do was to go into the magician to avoid pain. I didn't have any warrior that we were talking about last week, so I got picked on and beat up and traumatized by shadow warriors. Well, if you don't have the power to stand up for that, the next best thing is to get as smart as you can to avoid the conflict. Well, then it's just a small step from that to avoid internal conflicts and to avoid internal painful feelings. So people can go all the way into disassociation, which is an actual clinical diagnosis. They become so into the magician, they successfully defend against going into the feelings. I would make a distinction between feelings and feeling function, because feeling function is a value judgment. It's knowing the value, the relative value of something. There are people who, and I was one of those, who just tried to detach from my emotional body because there was so much pain in it. And even the physical body, you can detach from your physical body. There's a wonderful line in James Joyce's famous novel Ulysses describing a character named Mr. Duffy. And the line is, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. That's a kind of detachment because the body carries all the pain. So if you have a lot of uh, emotional pain that you don't have the capability or you've never learned how to, or you don't have a safe place to process, well, then intellectualizing it becomes an easy next step. And it certainly can be a defense. Absolutely.
How can someone cultivate a mature magician energy without falling into intellectual arrogance or spiritual bypassing?
That last one's a very important one because that also has to do with a defense. If I have a problem, but then I move to a sort of superficial spiritual solution, again as a defense, so I don't have to actually deal with it. You'll see a lot of this related to what we were talking about last week with the warrior archetype. There are a lot of people who become peace loving as a way of avoiding developing their aggression because it's just easier to become a spiritual type and to think you're really on the high moral ground. But what you missed is the ability to set boundaries, the ability to be fierce when you need to be fierce, the ability to advocate, the ability to protect those who are vulnerable. You miss developing all those things in a kind of spiritual bypass. And there's often a good bit of narcissism attached with it as well. I'm sort of superior to all you other people who do this, and I just, above all that. I'm all for spiritual connection and development. And in fact, I would go so far as to say getting these archetypes regulated is a necessary step to actually connecting with the deepest parts of ourselves where we can actually legitimately affect it. But one very, very helpful thing is to learn about these archetypes. Because if you know that your job is to mediate the archetype, not become the archetype, that's a very helpful piece of information, because it helps you with inflation, first of all. So if you can acknowledge that you are in service in a particular function, let's say you're a workshop leader, and one route to go down would be convincing yourself that you're just the best workshop leader in the world. And you're kind of not Jesus, but you're certainly here to save a good bit of the world. Well, obviously, that's generally going to be pretty big inflation. Whereas if you realize, no, my job is to help mediate this energy that has to do with initiation so I can help people transition through these developmental processes. That's a very, very, very different frame. And it helps keep you grounded, and it helps keep you from becoming inflated. Because the magician sits opposite the sovereign, which we have not talked about yet, but we will. The sovereign, everybody is in awe of the sovereign energy. And so the kings and the queens get all the accolades, whereas they're often not particularly connected to magician material, so they're often not full of wisdom. They're not often full of knowledge. So here's the magician over here, who's usually the lone character that lives off at the edge of the kingdom. So there's a secret power drive. It's unconscious and hidden, but very frequently what happens is people go into magician vocations, and once they become successful in that vocation, they flip into the shadow side of the sovereign because of this hidden power drive. So if you're aware that there is an archetype of the magician, and that you're supposed to be, if you're practicing a magician vocation, you're supposed to be in service to that archetype, or embodying and mediating that archetype to whatever your group is you're working with.
Oh my gosh, that just answered the question of what's going on with my body.
This will become clear when we talk about the sovereign. You'll just have to take my word for it today, but that's part of the trap of the magician. Is magicians sort of secretly resentful because, see, the magician sees things other people don't. Well, if other people don't see it, they can't give you any credit for what they see you doing. So the magicians get the least amount of credit, even though they know the most and they can see the most, but they generally don't do anything other than active forces and initiatory kind of capacities. So there's a secret resentment, and then there's a power drive, an unconscious power drive, and then people flip from the undeveloped, I would say, fully mature magician into the undeveloped, immature king and queen. And this happens over and over and over again. It happens when guru situations. It happens where a guru may start off and they actually have some really good, great things to say. They're really in that magician, and they get a flock of people following them. And then those people start projecting on them and idealizing them. And then they start getting convinced that, oh, yeah, they really are God's gift of whatever. And then pretty soon they're over into that shadow king. And then if things don't have some kind of regulation on it, it just gets more and more pathological. And the obvious examples from the last 50 years are things like the Jim Jones group in Guyana, where this guy started off as a minister in a church in San Francisco, I think is where it was, and was apparently doing a lot of really great social work. But then he just got more and more inflated and more megalomaniac, and eventually took a group down to Guyana. And when the whole thing started falling apart, he convinced everybody to drink Kool-Aid with cyanide, and 960 or so people lost their lives. That's the kind of pathology that is extreme, of course, and most shadow magicians and shadow kings don't go to that far, but I'm just telling you that story to kind of give you the gist of it.
I just was thinking about all these movies where you see the smart and genius scientist becomes the evil scientist
Yep.
because he doesn't receive the credit, and then he's just so hungry for power, then suddenly he creates something so powerful, and now he starts flooding with all this power and just how we feel to just rule the whole world, and evil scientist character is is born for sure. Yeah,
If you'll indulge me, I'll take a minute and a half and I'll tell you a story that's the counter to that. And
absolutely.
it's not my story. I got it from William Ury at a TED talk. It's called The 18th Camel. And it's a story from the Middle East, but it's a story about a man who, when he died, in his will, he left his 17 camels to his 3 sons. To the oldest son, he gave half of the camels. And to the middle son, he gave a third of the camels. And to the youngest son, he gave a ninth of the camels. So the 3 sons are trying to figure out how to divide up these camels. And of course, they're running into a problem immediately because 17 is not divisible by 50% or half, at least not even. Um, a third doesn't go into 17, and a ninth doesn't go into 17. And so the tension is getting greater and greater, and they're about to come to blows over the whole thing. And so they finally, in desperation, they go and consult a wise old woman. And she says, I'll go away and think about it. So she goes away, she thinks about their problem. She comes back and she says, well, I'm not sure if I can help you or not, but you can have my camel. So they take her camel. Now they have 18 camels. So the first son took 50% of that, is 9 camels. Second son was able to take his third because a third of 18 is 6. And the third son was able to take his ninth because a ninth of 18 is 2. So 2 and 6 and 9 is 17. So they had 1 camel left over. They gave it back to the wise old woman.
That's
Now
great.
that's a magician story, okay? And wise old woman is the feminine part of the wise old man, which is the magician, one of the personifications of the magician. The opposite of manipulation for power. And whereas in this case, it takes kind of a magician to figure out how to divide camels. Anyway, thanks for letting me tell that story. I don't get to tell it often. I love it. And again, it's from William Ury, not from me.
That was a great story. Thank you, James.
Well, I would generally, in the bigger picture, while it's true that we need to develop a cohesive self, and this cohesive self is what we refer to as the ego. So in some sense, getting these regulated and balanced is absolutely about building a better ego, but it's also a better ego so the ego can be in service to the great self within. And that's what a lot of this comes down to, is getting to a place where we're not in service to very small, just ego orientated ideas and power drives, but something greater than ourselves. So the magician, the warrior, the lover, all need to be in service to the sovereign, which in turn needs to be in service to something greater than itself. And when things are not in service to something else greater than themselves, they tend to turn pathological. We're certainly facing a tidal wave of narcissism right now because it's very hard for people to even entertain the idea that they're supposed to be doing anything bigger than themselves or bigger than amassing a bunch of money or a lot of possessions. And I think that's one of our major problems. That is part of an individuation process. The magician, where it comes in, is because it's the one that would even know about something called initiation or individuation. It is the guide. It is the ritual elder, for example, that is supposed to oversee these processes. And ritual process is what helps us deal with archetypal energies. It is the structural software, if you will, that allows us to deal with the hardware of the archetypes. And without appropriate ritual, which is what we are badly missing, experiential ritual, we have a lot of ceremony, but we don't do much ritual. You could count, well, going to church every Sunday is a ritual. Yeah, but it was all rational orientated. Nobody expected to break through a spirit there. In fact, there was no room for spirit to come about or for somebody to have a powerful awakening or go through a powerful confrontation with the unconscious because everything was rigid. I mean, when you walk in the door, they handed you a piece of paper that told you everything that was going to happen. At 11:10, we're going to sing this song, and then 11:15, so and so is going to do a prayer, and at 11:20 we take up the collection. I mean, no place in there where, well, let's put aside 10 minutes to see if God wants to show up, or if somebody needs to go through an emotional process that might take them into their own unconscious, which might lead them to a powerful spiritual. None of that. Whereas the original practice of religion, as far as I can determine, and I'm not claiming to be a religious scholar here, but it would appear to me that the main function of the ritual elder in early human experience is development of ritual processes in order to be able to deal with these archetypes. We've gotten so far away from that that there's almost no place or very few places that I guess I would say I truly believe qualifies as ritual process is actual breathwork experience. It has all the components of a ritual process, including a ritual elder. So our detachment and moving away from conscious practice and in effect having a center between the ego and the transpersonal archetypal self, a bridge between those two, is one of the things that is why we have so much pathology, why we have so much dysfunction and so much narcissism, because these archetypes don't have a bridge to cross over between those two. And that bridge, this is Edward Edinger's idea, by the way, not mine, but that bridge, because it's not complete and it's been left in disrepair, the archetypes tend to fall off and they fall into smaller containers of which are incapable of holding them. And when that happens, they crack the containers and they leak out and then they become uncontained and thus they become pathological and even in some cases demonic. So for example, the lover energy, too much lover, you get the addicted lover. And I would say that absolutely describes Western culture. When you realize that a massive percentage of products that are sold in this country are not sold because people need them, they're sold because people want them. And a good bit of effort and creativity and energy is putting into changing what we have now that works perfectly well, but put it into a prettier package so that everybody desires that package. But we're missing conscious, culturally sanctioned rituals and rites of passage that help people go through these transitionary initiations throughout life, not just the puberty transition. But that's one of the main ones that's missing. We don't do anything at puberty anymore. That was one of the main ritual practice of primitive cultures, so-called primitive cultures.
The magician is often associated with initiation and sacred space. Could you talk a little bit about sacred space and what that looks like in the magician realm?
Yes, because it is the realm of the magician. And the magician, in some sense, is the one who knows about that space or who can consecrate space so that it becomes sacred. In primitive culture, this might be the shaman who leads everybody on a pilgrimage to a sacred space and determines which space is sacred. And sacred, it means inside the temple. And then profane space is that which is outside the temple. In other words, the issue, the idea of containment comes into here very, very profoundly. For example, if you're going to have people doing a ritual process, there are some safety things that need to happen. You need to be in contained space. You need to have a sense of boundaries. This is one of the functions of churches. And back when they really, really understood this at its highest, I would say, are the Gothic cathedrals in Europe. I mean, you could be an outright committed, total atheist and walk into one of those cathedrals and you're going to feel differently. You might resist calling it sacred, but boy, I don't know how you can do it because I've been in numbers of them. And the sacred geometry, the stained glass windows, the whole architecture of the place, the awe and wonder you experience that people built these things before they had electricity or hydraulics. They're truly amazing. But it's sacred space also refers to that place within that we consider to be sacred, that we value, that we experience awe and wonder. Think of nature. We no longer, for many of us, think of nature as sacred. We think of nature, particularly in the West, in terms of commercial interest. So you go to a giant grove of redwood trees, you don't see beauty and awe and wonder, you see board feet of lumber and how much per foot you can get for that. So it's a very, very different frame. The magician is the one who knows about sacred space, knows how to co-create sacred space and consecrate sacred space and keep it safe. And also what's supposed to happen within the sacred space. And also that you're not supposed to be in sacred space 24/7. Sacred space is supposed to be the two mountain peaks that sustain us as we go through the flat valleys of life. And when you try to live in that liminal space, it'll make you crazy. So whether you do it, say, for example, by taking a whole lot of psychedelics, way too many psychedelics, which many people did in the 1960s, it could drive you into a permanent psychosis. Or you just try to, you're 17 and you decide to go become a resident at an ashram in India because it's exotic, and you give up and start practicing a path of renunciation. And so you're trying to give up a self that you haven't even created yet. And you can get into chronic liminality. Like everything, as Jung would say, push too far, anything can turn into its opposite. That's briefly what sacred space is about.
Thank you.
So, James, you were speaking about the individuation, initiation. And so, how does it look like when a person is connecting maturely with the magician archetype within?
Well, I would back it up a little bit and say that generally speaking, for most of us, I think we're going to meet the magician archetype outside of ourselves in the form of a human who's carrying it for us. In other words, there's a kind of, we're not really connected to the magicians. We find a good magician, and I stress good magician figure, we can project our unowned magician onto them, they'll hold it, and then they'll feed it back to us at a rate that we can absorb it. Now, if you get hooked up with a shadow magician, one of the things you'll notice is they're not interested in giving any of the gold back to you. They're just interested in you continuing to aggrandize them and project on them, and that's the real difference between liminal and liminoid. Once you get deeply involved in these processes and you gain some sophistication about it, then you can try to connect to the magician in many ways. One would be ritual, one would be visualization, things like the process that Jung discovered called active imagination, artwork, using images, even things like analyzing movies. I've learned tremendous amount about these four archetypes from the study of film. A really great film will have these elements in it. And so I watched the film the first time just for entertainment. I come back and watch it the second time, and what I'm watching for the second time is who's carrying which archetype the most. Or another way to say it is who's representing the magician, who's representing the warrior. Is there any development here? Is it a failed initiation, or is it a successful initiation? In other words, you're using the film as an animated set of images and a reduction, getting rid of the minutia, to get to the story that underlies both our outer world and our inner world. And that story of initiation, once you start working with it, you begin to realize that we're going through and being called to go through and challenged to go through initiations all the time, not just when we're transitioning from being a child to an adult. There are life cycle connected initiations. There are bidden and unbidden initiations. A bidden initiation would be, oh, I see this workshop that Maureen is doing. I'm going to sign up and go for that. And you go there and you have this experience, which then opens up the door for another experience. And so it can kick you into an initiatory process. The other way is that life hands it to you. You come into work on Friday and there's this pink slip on your desk. Your services are no longer needed. And it's especially initiatory if you've worked there 28 years and you were about to retire next year. It's those kind of crises that throw us into the initiatory process. Initiation has a kind of an archetypal pattern of its own. It's either life cycle or it's bid, like you decided to do a magician vocation. If you have a crisis that initiates this, it may just feel like you're not, I mean, it may not feel like an initiation. It just feels like you got really bad luck. But working at it as a double layer is not avoiding what you have to do in the outer world, but seeing how this connects to your individuation process. It could also be suddenly a bit of your shadow comes up and you become aware of it and you have to face it. That's an initiation. So there are a lot of ways we can talk about this, but here's the simplest way to think about initiation. It is a process whereby our old world rips, our old assumptive world that's made up of our beliefs, our perceptions, our traumas, our past, our history, but that world rips somehow. The fabric of that world rips, and momentarily we're without a world, and that's really a very, very painful place to be. But we're also finding ourselves at a threshold, and we either cross over the threshold into the initiatory container, which is hopefully overseen by a good ritual elder, and then we go through a series of ordeals, usually facing dragons and shadows and ugly things about ourselves we don't want to look at, or developments we haven't done that we need to do that we're terrified of doing. And if we successfully come out and meet all those challenges, we come out on the other side of the initiation with a changed sense of self. The world may not change at all, but we change. And hopefully we are in a better place, both inner and outer. We're in a better position of integration. We're in a better position of the ability to face and succeed when we're challenged, either in the outer world or in the inner world. And then once you have that changed sense of self, you're supposed to bring that back to your culture and share those gifts.
James, can you talk about the 4 stages of development of the magician?
The first stage of the magician is the beginning stage, and it's where you don't know how much you don't know. Unconscious incompetence, what people overestimate. You have a 16-year-old kid who's watched one too many Bruce Lee movies. But because he's watched all those movies, he decides he's going to go down and join the local martial arts training facility. And all the way down there, he's thinking to himself, I've got all these moves down, they'll probably give me a black belt within a month. And of course, he has no idea. He doesn't know anything. And he goes there and he gets his first lesson, and the first person they pair him up with is an 80-year-old man who looks like you could blow him over with a good puff of wind. And he thinks to himself, oh, I'll better watch myself. I'll wind up killing this old man. But in point of fact, as soon as they give the signal to go, he's flat on his back on the floor, doesn't have any idea how the old man got him there in half of a second. Well, the old man is a master. That's how it happened. But that's the unconscious incompetence. Now, hopefully, the person will move to the next level, which is extremely important level. And this is where you wake up to the fact that you don't know anything. In other words, you confront your infantile grandiosity, your overestimation of your talents. And this is extremely important because now you can consciously elect to become a beginner, to start at the beginning, to even be the fool if you need to be. By the way, that's called conscious incompetence. Extremely important level because, of course, when you start something, you don't know how to do it very well. And if you keep at that and you have good teachers and you keep practicing, eventually now you can begin the real work. And then after you've gotten really good at it, you move to the next level, which is conscious competence. In this level, you can do it meaning whatever it is, a skill, a practice, even something like martial arts, but you have to think about it. But when you think about it, you can do it. You know how to do all this, sort of the journeyman level, if you will. The final level, which probably very few actually attain, but it's called the master level. And this is unconscious competence, meaning you're competent and you don't even have to think about it. Like the old man I used in the example, the old martial arts master, he didn't have to think about those movements. They were all automatic. There was no thought process. It's just that quick. Well, the master is like that. They don't even have to think about it anymore. They're just unconsciously competent. Well, that's a really good way for us to check in with ourselves and go, where have I been acting in which one of these? And my goal would be, of course, to try to reach the perhaps sometimes unattainable master level, but it's a good goal to shoot for. But I'm certainly going to try to at least get to journeyman level. Now, this could be applied to basically anything, our relationships, our insights into ourselves, our skill at a practice. Because I've realized that a lot of my life, I was like that 16-year-old kid driving to the dojon, overestimating what I could do. It's not grandiose if you can do it. So we also have to not push everything too far and think, well, I can't do anything ever, because then that's our inner critic, inner shamer coming in. Once you really get good at something, you should be able to claim that and have appropriate self-esteem based upon that. It's where you get more self-esteem than you deserve for your skill level set is where you get into problems. That's inflation.
That was great.
Is it a wrap? So I will
It's
just
a wrap.
thank you for joining us in this conversation about the magician on the Shadow Nose Project. And we're so grateful for you, James, for sharing your story and opening a doorway into breathwork and Jungian coaching for us.
You're welcome.
Yes, James. Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your wisdom. And we're looking forward to our next episode, which will be on the sovereign.
And if today's episode spoke to you, we'd love for you to subscribe.
Like our channel, the Shadow Nose Project.
Until next time, may you walk gently with your shadow and may the wisdom guide you home. And remember,
The
the
Shadow
shadow
knows.
knows.
Cool.